Stan Maisie served as the second in command of the 5th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, from January 1966 until December 1966, when he moved on to become the Senior Operations Staff Officer at Headquarters, 1st Australian Task Force. He spent a total of 16 months in Vietnam, with 8 months each in 5RR and HQ-1 ATF. Sadly, he passed away on June 18, 2018, while this book was still in progress. Fortunately, some years earlier, he had penned an article reflecting on his experiences with 5RR and had approved its publication in Vietnam Vanguard. This chapter focuses on how 5RR's preparations for its first deployment to Vietnam and the logistical challenges faced during that time. Preparing for a lengthy deployment is a complex task, particularly when it comes to gathering the necessary equipment. As the second in command, it was primarily Stan's responsibility to ensure that the battalion was fully equipped for combat. If we couldn't secure everything we needed in Australia, he had to negotiate with the Americans to fill in any gaps in equipment and supplies. Considering that Australia hadn't deployed a multi-battalion-sized force overseas since the Korean War in the early 1950s, there was much to accomplish before 5RR and 6RR headed to Vietnam in April 1966. Here's Stan's first-hand account of how he faced the challenges during 5RR's early service in Vietnam. I was assigned as the second-in-command of 5RR in December 1965, arriving at Gallipoli Barracks, Holsworthy, in early January 1966. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel John War, was visiting 1RAR in Bien Hoa, South Vietnam, but had left training instructions for us until his return. At that time, the battalion comprised a core group of regular Army officers, non-commissioned officers, and men. Reinforcements began arriving in September 1965, including many national servicemen from the Officer Training Unit in Shaeville and various NS recruit training battalions. Although there was no official confirmation, it was understood that 5RR would take over from 1RAR in Vietnam around April or May 1966. Correspondence between the battalions was underway, and the logistical details included bringing as much timber and flooring as possible. It's important to scale the inventory of consumable items to last at least 6 months, instead of the 3 months mentioned in the various equipment tables. Additionally, we need to acquire a fisheye lens for the movie projector and familiarize ourselves with the various U.S. codes, such as dust-off for casualty evacuation, along with the requisition procedures. We also need to get accustomed to U.S. rations. Training for the battalion focused on shooting, platoon drills, company movements, helicopter familiarization, and building camaraderie. Throughout February and early March 1966, each company participated in a training exercise at the Gospers training area near Rylstone, NS Woth, followed by evaluations at the Jungle Training Center in Canungra Coolwood. In March, a battalion exercise took place under the CO's direction in the Gospers area, immediately succeeded by an assessed exercise conducted by HQ 1st Task Force at Holsworthy. During this time, the quartermaster's staff worked tirelessly to ensure the battalion was well equipped. However, the Army's supply depots refused our requisitions because we submitted them in a multi-listed format instead of as single items, which required all battalion clerks to assist the QM for about 10 days to redo the paperwork. Compounding the issue, since there hadn't been an official announcement regarding our replacement of 1RAR in Vietnam, our requisitions for items listed in the infantry battalion equipment tables were marked as not approved and sent back. When we followed 1RAR's suggestion to adjust our inventory for 6 months, the staff officers at HQ Eastern Command either declined the extra request or insisted that items were to be taken over from 1RAR in place. It wasn't until late February or early March 1966, after the announcement of a significant increase in the Australian commitment to a 2-battalion task force, along with the 1st Australian Logistics Support Group, that our requests were finally processed, albeit reluctantly. However, with the implementation of national service in June 1965, many clothing and equipment items were in short supply, revealing how inadequate the Army's procurement system really was. For instance, some soldiers only had 1 set of jungle greens. Most soldiers wore limited uniforms, mostly an outdated khaki summer uniform for protection. They typically had just one pair of calf-length general-purpose boots with protective stainless steel inserts in the soles. Each soldier received a pair of tropical studded ankle boots from 1944 and some canvas gaiters. They all had the full allocation of personal load-carrying equipment, with little to no reserves in the battalion's supply store. In the final training exercise, the battalion utilized a range of equipment that had just arrived, still under wraps. Despite the terrible weather, we managed to secure a rum issue for everyone, thanks to the regimental medical officer's cooperation. During the prep phase, with advice from 1RR, we attempted to offload our anti-tank weapons, specifically an 84mm rocket launcher for each rifle company and 6 106mm recoilless rifles held by the anti-tank platoon. Unfortunately, we weren't able to make that happen. The recoilless rifles were mounted on modified Land Rovers, and after some discussion, our armorer, Sergeant Mick Henrys, proposed fitting a machine gun onto each vehicle for convoy security. These 6 vehicles came to be known as sports cars, proving invaluable in their modified, albeit technically questionable, roles. We had to take the anti-tank gear with us to war, where it sat unused in the supply store, except for 2 106mm RCLs located by the flagpole, supposedly guarding battalion headquarters. Simultaneously, with support from 1RR, we tried to revise the equipment table to acquire more M60 general-purpose machine guns, radios, and telephones for the base's defense, but our request was denied until the commanding officer personally confirmed the need. As we prepared our personnel and supplies, despite the issues with the ordnance stores, the support from the engineer and medical systems was outstanding. The engineers provided us with ample timber, and the School of Military Engineering at Kasula sent instructors to train us in handling mines, booby traps, barbed wire, and sandbagging. The medical system, especially the 2-camp hospital at Ingleburn, also played a significant role. Instructors taught us first aid, health, hygiene, and essential supplies, placing a strong emphasis on vaccinations for battalion members. In April 1966, the battalion's advance party took a flight out, first teaming up with 1RR at Bien Hoa. Then, we moved on to the sandy dunes of Vung Tau to set up a camp for the battalion ahead of moving into the 1ATF base at Nui Dat. C Company, along with all our stores, equipment, and vehicles, left in mid-April 1966 aboard HMAS Sydney, while the rest of the battalion flew out from Richmond RAF base over the next 3 weeks on Boeing 707s. By mid-May 1966, the last part of the battalion, including myself, set off for South Vietnam. Upon landing at Tan Son Nhut in Saigon, we gathered our weapons and equipment before boarding a US C-123 provider for the trip to Vung Tau. We sat in the aircraft for nearly 2 hours, sweating it out in the heat and humidity before we finally took off. When we arrived in Vietnam, it quickly became clear that some of the gear we were supposed to take over from 1RR was damaged from a year of heavy use, particularly the tents and M16 rifles. The rifles came without cleaning kits, so our armorers had to make cleaning rods from sturdy fencing wire. Life in Vung Tau was fast-paced as we got used to the climate, familiarized ourselves with our supporting troops and their lingo, and took part in aerial reconnaissance of Phuoc Tuy province. Some of those flights were quite intense. A special mention goes to the U.S. Army's 68 Assault Helicopter Company based at Vung Tau Air Base. They provided outstanding support whenever we needed it. Just before we left Vung Tau, we had an officers' dining-in night at the Pacific Hotel, a grand French colonial establishment repurposed for U.S. officers. The battalion supplied the cooks and stewards, and the battalion band delivered an amazing performance of those magnificent men in their flying machines that really got the crowd cheering. Operation Hardihood, which involved clearing and then settling into the task force's operational base at Nui Dat, started in mid-May 1966. Initially, the U.S. 173 Airborne Brigade led the operation, and by late May, 5 RAR had been placed under their command for the final stages. The battalion received support from a company of 1RR. During the operation, they were quite active north of Nui Dat, engaging primarily with small groups of 3 to 5 Viet Cong. By early June 1966, our confrontations with the enemy had lessened, leading us to decide to occupy the task force base at Nui Dat. Before the administrative groups from the battalion and task force moved into the area, we were alerted to a potential assault by the 274 Viet Cong Regiment. The commanding officer quickly called for an urgent resupply of ammunition, especially belted rounds for the M60 machine guns, claymore mines, and mortar shells. While the ammo was being gathered, I requested helicopter support from the U.S. Army's 68 Assault Helicopter Company to transport the heavy loads. Our QM platoon had unwrapped most of the packaging to save weight, but there was still a significant amount to move. When the helicopters arrived, I inquired about the weight capacity of each aircraft. In a typical laid-back manner, the pilot told me to fill it up. Once we loaded as much as we could, he gave us the thumbs up, lifted off just a meter, bounced to about 3 meters, moved forward, bounced again, and finally took to the air. Life at Nui Dat was a constant challenge, battling the elements as the wet monsoon season began, dealing with shortages of supplies and equipment, coping with the discomforts of our makeshift home, and struggling to adequately defend the base while the battalion was engaged in operations, all while we worked on the base's defensive structures. Many issues complicated our efforts. Every time we dug a weapon pit, it filled with water before we could put in any overhead protection because of the wet season. Thankfully, the weather wasn't cold. Filling sandbags with wet clay, which was the only filling material available at Nui Dat, was extremely difficult. So, whenever I could, I sent a convoy of Land Rovers and trailers to Vung Tau to fill sandbags with actual sand. When the battalion was out on operations, only 3 radios remained in the base area, mine and those of the OC Administration Company and the QM. Our field phones were needed for operations, so we literally resorted to using message sticks to communicate between company positions at Nui Dat until the scrounging platoon was formed for obvious reasons. The company 2 ICs, quartermaster sergeants, and most of the administration company discovered an unattended switchboard, along with some telephones and radios by the roadside. The more concerning issue, however, was the shortage of machine guns needed to defend the base. Administration Company had a few heavy-barreled rifles that could fire automatically, but that was the extent of our defensive arsenal. Fortunately, the scrounging platoon managed to barter a couple of slouch hats and some butter with our allies, acquiring several 30 and 50 caliber machine guns. We quickly mounted the 30 calibers onto the sports cars and set the 50 calibers up in bunkers around the company areas. Additionally, we secured more defensive supplies by visiting the U.S. Supply Depot in Vung Tau, utilizing our Land Rovers and trailers. We left that depot with our trailers filled to the brim, along with a stores truck and a water truck. After spending most of the day at what felt like a supermarket, the new guard on duty requested written authorization, which we didn't have. As night fell and the road to Nui Dat was deemed unsafe, I politely explained that we could sort out the paperwork later. I sent the convoy on its way, and as the sergeant went into the guardroom for advice, I took off. The sergeant fired at us, but thankfully his aim was off. This excursion ultimately made us feel more secure and at ease. By July 1966, we were grappling with significant shortages. We had no replacement clothing, boots, or personal gear for our troops. The tropical studded boots from 1944 were now a feast for the rubber ants, and our clothing had worn out beyond repair. Although we scavenged personal equipment from administrative elements, only about 2/3 of the fighting troops could be outfitted for operations. During a visit from Major General Ken McKay, the commander of the Australian force in Vietnam, the CO was seen wearing a badly tattered shirt. Upon learning of our difficulties, the commander had his QM store in Saigon searched, resulting in us receiving around 100 sets of clothing and a box of equipment. Many soldiers were not living in tents since the new tents had arrived without poles, and a C-130 transport aircraft from the RF that was supposed to bring supplies was delayed. Poles arrived brimming with toilet paper, while the transport ship HMS Jeparit came in, but many crates were empty. We could only assume there had been some sabotage. Due to issues with the belted ammunition for the M60 GPMG, we decided to create a sheath for each 100-round belt, using inflatable inserts from the field mattresses we usually slept on. This measure kept debris off the belts, but the ammunition tended to sweat, causing the steel links connecting each round to rust quickly. So, we opted to use regimental funds to procure a gross of WD-40 aerosol cans for anti-rust spray. After a few weeks without any goods arriving, we started looking into it and discovered they were found, along with crates of GP boots and green floppy hats, at the garbage dump in Vung Tau. Clearly, some folks at 1ALSG needed to step up their game. Next, we faced a serious problem with food. Australian combat rations were scarce, forcing us to rely on the bulky and often disliked U.S. combat rations. When the battalion was set to return from operations, we would place orders for fresh rations, but it often felt like the arrival of fresh supplies meant we'd be sent back to operations, where those individual, packaged combat rations would be consumed. With the installation of cool rooms delayed at our base, the fresh rations would spoil quickly. In fact, the CO received a bill in August for $25,000 for fresh rations. These were the spoiled items that our RMO and QM had written off. One soldier even asked the CO not to order fresh rations because their arrival usually meant the battalion would have to head back to operations. By the end of July 1966, the fresh ration supply completely failed, leaving us with nothing but frankfurts and sweet corn for about 5 weeks. We had them baked, boiled, fried, grilled, and minced. I even sent our warrant officer caterer 300 kilometers to Dalat in central South Vietnam's highlands to buy fresh vegetables, once again using our regimental funds. The broken system was evident when we repeatedly received deliveries of fresh rations and ice cream while the battalion was out on operations, with no refrigerated storage available at the base. By mid-September 1966, our home was starting to feel a bit more livable. While the battalion was out on operations, the support team was hard at work building and improving the base area. A large movie screen was put up, and we were lucky to come across a fisheye cinemascope lens found in a U.S. amenities unit in Saigon. In our outdoor theater, dubbed the Mayfair, we set up a small kitchen to serve steak sandwiches, hot dogs, and the CO's favorite, gophers, which were flavored milk in a can that could be enjoyed hot or cold. Soft drinks had the same nickname. The screen was impressive, reminiscent of those old drive-in movie screens, though I can't say for sure if any VC lurking nearby appreciated our film choices. Tents were pitched, and the cool rooms and refrigeration units were brought in and set up. Once a couple of Nissan huts arrived, they were designated for the RMO and chaplains. The rain was letting up, the nights were cooler, and the company kitchens and canteens were operational, with the QM store beginning to receive much-needed replacement clothing and gear. During operations, whenever our troops in the field needed maintenance resupplies, we had the company cooks whip up hot soup, delivering it in plastic jerry cans and steak sandwiches. These fresh meals offered our men a welcome change from the usual combat rations. On August 18, 1966, D Company of 6 RAR engaged in the Battle of Long Tan, utilizing RF Iroquois helicopters for combat resupply under heavy rain in the late afternoon. The RF performed admirably. Before this battle, they seemed to be restricted by peacetime regulations from Australia, but after Long Tan they felt like genuine team members. However, during Operation Queen Bayan in October 1966, the battalion was tasked with clearing the Nui Thivai Hills. As we advanced, we encountered occupied caves, live booby traps, and determined VC forces opposing us. The CO opted to clear the caves using flamethrowers. We gathered the necessary equipment and incendiary fuel at Nui Dat, and when the RAF Iroquois arrived to transport them to Nui Thivai, the pilot informed us he couldn't carry fuel in his aircraft. After discussing the situation with the pilot, I reached out to higher authority, namely the task force commander, who then intervened. The RF component commander and Coma FV joined the conversation. They agreed to transport the fuel as long as the steel jerry cans were packed in wooden crates. Meanwhile, our troops, engaged with the enemy, had to be patient while this matter was sorted out. In November 1966, I stepped in as the operations officer, while Max Carroll took some well-deserved time off. During this period, 5 RR carried out a cordon and search in the small village of Phuoc Hoa, located northwest of Ba Ria on Route 15. Right after that, we were tasked with clearing Long Son Island, which the VC used as a route between the Mekong River and the Nui Thi Vai Hills. The task force commander chose to set up his headquarters on the island for this mission. These operations allowed me a break from administrative responsibilities and offered valuable operational experience for my next role as the operations officer at task force headquarters. I was set to leave the battalion in mid-December 1966 after what had been an extremely eventful year, truly one for the books. We've included this chapter, focusing on administrative and logistic issues, to highlight their crucial role in shaping operational capability. History has shown in past conflicts that transforming a peacetime army into a wartime force is a lengthy process. Achieving full operational capability from square one requires immense effort, determination, and creativity. We in 5RR were fortunate to have Stan Mazie as our second-in-command and chief logistics officer. He understood precisely what we needed to have ready for our operations in Vietnam. He demonstrated remarkable resolve and negotiating skills to secure our requirements, both in Australia and Vietnam. Once he ensured we had sufficient supplies and equipment to engage in combat with confidence, he maintained our stocks of food, fuel, ammunition, tents, and other vital resources at the levels we needed. On a personal level, he was one of the battalion's standout characters, possessing a sharp sense of humor, a love for sports, especially when it involved betting, and a strong commitment to enhancing the everyday lives of our soldiers when they weren't on duty by ensuring they received good meals and had a place to unwind and enjoy a drink or two. His desire to improve their experience was commendable. Providing exceptional service to those who depended on him was a deep personal dedication to the regiment, referring to the Royal Australian Regiment. He viewed serving operationally with a battalion of the regiment as his greatest ambition and the most fulfilling period of his career.